Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us at the inaugural webinar of the APRIGF WSIS+20 Working Group. The title of this session is Introducing the WSIS+20 for the Asia-Pacific Internet Community. I'm Joyce Chen, Senior Advisor for Strategic Engagement at APNIC and the Chair of the APRIGF WSIS+20 Working Group, and my role today is to be the moderator for this webinar. For those of us who have been deeply involved in internet governance, WSIS, or the World Summit on the Information Society, is foundational to the IGF. It is the very reason that NRIs or national regional initiatives such as the APRIGF exist today. As the multilateral negotiations are heating up for WSIS+20 at the UN, it is timely that we, the APRIGF community, pay attention and consider how we should contribute to this process. Now, this is the first webinar in a series of webinars that will take place regarding WSIS+20 this year, coming from the WSIS+20 Working Group. So for this session, we are going back to the beginning by starting from basics. And this session is really about doing a level setting for those of you who might be newcomers to this process. As such, we have invited four esteemed speakers, Serena Telenu, William Lee, Jennifer Chung, and Anita Gurumurthy. Allow me some time to just give a brief introduction of our speakers, and then we can proceed with the panel. So Serena is the Director of Knowledge at the Diplo Foundation. She's based in Geneva, Switzerland. Thanks, Serena, for joining us from afar. Serena focuses on exploring the intersection between digital technology and global governance through conducting research, lecturing for various capacity development programs, in particular for policymakers and diplomats, and delivering regular briefings for the diplomatic community. She is also a visiting professor at the College of Europe, where she teaches a course on digital diplomacy. Serena has worked in the internet and digital policy field for over 15 years in roles involving policymaking, research, capacity development, and stakeholder engagement. William, our next speaker, is the Assistant Director, Internet Governance within Australia's Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications, Sport, and the Arts, possibly the longest name of a government department in the world, where he leads on internet governance, public policy, and multilateral engagement. William is an experienced policy practitioner, previously working across various complex policy and legislative topics, including international mail, yes, and e-commerce, urban planning, infrastructure, transport, and intergovernmental affairs at both national and subnational levels. Currently, William serves as the policy lead for Australia's preparations to the World Summit on the Information Society 20-year review, WSIS+20. So warm welcome to you, William. Thanks for joining us. Next, we have Jennifer, who is the Vice President Policy for .Asia organization. She represents the .Asia registry at ICANN and is a GNSO counselor. She headed the ICG Secretariat that oversaw the IANA stewardship transition from the US government to the global multi-stakeholder community. Jennifer is appointed to the IGF MAG. She is doing her second term, so this year in 2025, and she was previously an IGF MAG member from 2018 to 2020. And as well, the 2022 expert working group that developed recommendations on strengthening the IGF. Jennifer heads the IGFSA Secretariat, which provides support to the IGF and grants to national, regional, and youth initiatives. She also serves in the APRIGF Secretariat, so she is very familiar to most of you. The ISF Asia Committee that awards grants supporting internet development in Asia Pacific, and is in the core secretariat of the TCCM, which no doubt we'll hear more about in this session. She also works on IDM policies and supports Universal Acceptance, a foundation for multilingual internet. And last but of course not least, Anita is a founding member and the executive director of IT for Change, where she leads research and advocacy on data and AI governance, platform regulation, and feminist frameworks on digital justice. She's a visiting fellow at the UN University International Institute for Global Health and serves as an expert on various bodies, including the T20's Digital Transformation Track and the UNCSTD's Working Group on Data Governance. Anita has been part of the high-level committee of the Net Mundial +10 under Brazil's leadership that took place last year, the UNSG's 10-member group on technology facilitation, and the Paris Peace Forum's working group on algorithmic governance. Anita is also a board member of global justice organizations such as the ETC Group and university centers such as the Tech and Policy Lab at the University of Western Australia. Anita contributes regularly to academic and media spaces. So with that, round of introductions, I'd like to first welcome our first speaker, Serena, who will give us some background and context regarding WSIS+20. Serena, over to you.
Thank you, Joyce. Hello, everyone. A pleasure to be here with you. Yes, I'll try to do that, to provide a bit of a background, taking us back through the history of WSIS, how it all started, and what exactly do we talk about when we talk about WSIS. Please do stop me at the 10 minutes because I do tend to talk a lot. And then happy to take questions and to engage with everyone. I'll try to share my slides. And ideally, you're seeing them. Okay, thank you for nodding. So WSIS, it stands, as I guess at this point everyone knows, for the World Summit on the Information Society, which was part of a series of summits that were held in early 2000, late 1990s, basically for the world to try to get a sense of what's going on and foster more cooperation between member states. The origins of WSIS actually go back to 1998, and for a bit of fun history, 1998 was quite an interesting year, and many of the elements of today's digital governance architecture were set back then. We call them the 1998 deals. It was the year when ICANN was formed, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. It was also the year when the UN General Assembly started discussing information security based on a draft resolution put forward by the Russian Federation. Also the year when the World Trade Organization issued a moratorium on custom duties, basically not placing taxation on electronic transmissions. And also the year when Google was born. So quite a lot of things happened in 1998 that then evolved into what we call today the digital governance architecture. So between 1998 and 2001, there were discussions within the International Telecommunication Union and also at the UN General Assembly about having this summit, which would discuss the information society and how to advance more cooperation at an international level to make sure that everyone can benefit from the opportunities offered by information and communication technologies. So in the end, the General Assembly approved the holding of the summit in 2 phases, and under the leadership, in some sense, of the Secretary General. So it was a UN summit in the sense that at the end of the day, it was member states making the final decisions, but it also had this multi-stakeholder nature. And this was something that kind of evolved throughout the summit and between the 2 phases, with more and more engagement and participation from other stakeholders, civil society, private sector, technical community, academia, and others. So there were these 2 main phases. The summit itself was quite long, between 2003 and 2005. And out of these 2 phases, we had 4 key outcome documents, which we talk about today as well. Most of them 2, and maybe not so much the other 2. And these are the Geneva Plan of Action and the Tunis Agenda for the Information Society. This is probably my favorite part from the WSIS outcomes, and this is more or less repeated across all 4 outcome documents, but it's basically outlining the vision that was set back then in 2003, 2005, which I think is still pretty much relevant today, and what you see on the screen is pretty much what we want to achieve. Maybe if we change a bit the terminology, we don't talk so much about ICT, but we talk about digital technologies, and maybe not so much information society, but digital society. And yet I think we still want a people-centered, inclusive, and development-oriented digital society. We still want everyone to be able to create, access, utilize, and share information and knowledge. We still want individual communities and people to achieve their full potential through the use of technology, and still want all of this to be based on the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So although we're talking about some documents that were adopted around 20 years ago, they are still pretty much extremely relevant. And speaking of documents adopted 20 years ago, I mentioned that one of the important ones was the Plan of Action. And what the Plan of Action did was to set the so-called action lines. So we have 11 kind of chapters, think of them like that, around a bunch of issues that governments and other stakeholders back then considered important when it comes to advancing this more inclusive information society. And what you see on the screen is an attempt to try to summarize these action lines, but I do encourage you to actually read the whole plan of action because, again, it's still pretty much relevant. It talks about advancing and deploying ICT infrastructure, advancing access to information and knowledge, building capacities, confidence and security in the use of ICT, cultural diversity, ethical dimensions of the information society. So a lot of things that we still talk about today. And you might have seen over the past 2-3 years, also in the context of discussions on the Global Digital Compact, that there were some voices saying, oh, well, these documents were adopted 20 years ago. They don't necessarily reflect the evolution of the digital society because they don't talk about artificial intelligence, for instance, or they don't talk about data governance. I would argue a bit against that because, for instance, if you look at action line C10 on the screen around the ethical dimension of the information society, it outlines quite a few principles that we talk a lot today when we talk about artificial intelligence, human autonomy, peace, and these kind of things that we still want to put in place when we discuss the governance of artificial intelligence. And the same around data. There is a bit of talk in the document around privacy and also this whole action line about access to information and knowledge. If we just look at that through the perspective of how we focus the discussions today on data, it's still extremely relevant. And maybe it would not be a bad idea for us to talk a bit more of knowledge as well, in addition to data, which tends to be a bit mathematical and, only numbers. So action lines, they were kind of recommendations for member states as to what actions to put in place to advance this more inclusive information society around those 11 main chapters. What the documents back in 2005 also did was to set a sort of a list of UN entities that would act as facilitators. So they would be responsible for supporting member states and other actors in implementing these action lines. And what you see on the screen are the current facilitators around these 11 action lines. I'm going to skip it, but just for you to have a mapping of who's doing what. And this on the screen is an attempt to put everything around WSIS on just one screen. I'm not going to go into details, just to highlight a few things. So we talked about action lines, recommendations for member states to put action in practice to advance this more inclusive information society and to ensure that everyone can benefit from the opportunities offered by ICT or the digital technologies. UN entities as facilitators. There was another mechanism created back then, and that was the UN Group on the Information Society, which is supposed to facilitate coordination within UN entities in following up on the implementation of WSIS outcomes. And then also in 2009, we had the first WSIS forum, which doesn't necessarily have a mandate in the WSIS documents as such, but it is a space where people come together and discuss and look at the implementation of WSIS action lines. Another key outcome of WSIS and the processes back then was around internet governance. Funnily enough, internet was not even mentioned in the first discussions around WSIS. When the first preparatory meetings were starting, it was all about ICT and these more broadly used terms. Then somehow internet made it to the discussions. And of course, there was this controversy. Actually, there were two controversies around internet and its governance. One was around what do we mean by internet governance? Are we talking about the management of core critical internet resources, domain names and internet protocol numbers? Or are we talking more broadly about the impact of the internet on economy, society, human rights, and whatnot? And the second controversy, obviously, was around who's doing internet governance and what roles and responsibilities the different actors would be having. Should governments be having more of a say? Should we take something out of ICANN and moving to some UN entity? There was quite a bit of controversy back then. And obviously, what does the UN do when they don't know how to deal with something? They create a working group. So we had the working group on internet governance, which then came up with a definition on internet governance and also with suggestions around the various roles and responsibilities of actors. And we had this then reflected in the Tunis agenda. which defines internet governance and takes this broader understanding as the management of everything and anything related to the impact of the internet on economy, society, human rights, social, cultural issues, and whatnot. And also keeps basically the management of the internet as it was back then, but then also created the Internet Governance Forum as some sort of a compromise, basically saying, okay, we're not going to touch how the internet is being managed right now, but we're going to create this space, a multi-stakeholder space, where discussions around these issues, around anything related to the governance of the internet will continue. And since then, as you know, we have been having the Internet Governance Forum held on an annual basis, called for by the UN Secretary General. And then the forum itself has evolved over the years with a bunch of intersessional activities and being a bit more than just an annual meeting. Another thing I do want to talk about, although I know it's kind of controversial, but it does appear in all these documents. And if anyone followed the discussions last Friday in New York, it did came up by some member states. This was around enhanced cooperation. So the Tunis agenda also included this second compromise, basically introducing the concept of enhanced cooperation as something aimed to enable governments, so something specifically related to governments, to carry out roles and responsibilities in international public policy issues pertaining to the internet. And then a process around what enhanced cooperation means and how to put it in practice was supposed to start. There were some working groups here in Geneva at the Commission on Science and Technology for Innovation. Member states couldn't really agree. Well, members of the working group, it was multi-stakeholder, couldn't really agree on what enhanced cooperation actually means and how to put it in practice. So there was no, concrete recommendations, but enhanced cooperation as a notion keeps appearing, for instance, every year in the UN General Assembly resolution on ICT for sustainable development. It was mentioned in the Global Digital Compact last year, and now we're seeing it coming up again, raised by some governments. So again, it's about how governments have more of a space for themselves to talk about these kind of issues, which if I were to give an opinion, I think the IGF could actually offer the space for that. Some of you might remember that not a few, but many years ago, there was this ministerial track or ministerial meeting at the IGF, which would have offered governments an opportunity to just talk about among themselves before going and talking to others, which may be something that can be brought back as we're discussing the renewal of the IGF mandate. So that's the context. Then we had reviews. The first review of implementation of WSIS outcomes was in 2015. It was requested by the initial WSIS outcome documents. You have a summary of the outcome on the screen. I'm going to skip it. And right now we're talking about the second review of WSIS outcome implementations, basically looking at what we have achieved over the past 20 years in putting this practice, the action lines and all the elements that were agreed back then. And I'm going to skip all of this because I think William is going to talk more in depth about this. I just want to look quickly at this. So what are the things that are supposed to be discussed in the context of the WSIS+20 review? As I was saying, looking at what we have achieved over the past 20 years, and maybe more importantly, what have we not achieved? For instance, where are we with bridging the digital divide, which is something that keeps coming up, and we obviously still have that issue. Then also looking at the processes and mechanisms. The mandate of the Internet Governance Forum will be up for discussion, but then also what do we do with enhanced cooperation? Maybe it's time to forget about it, or maybe not. So what's happening there? And then this interplay between WSIS, its outcomes, the Agenda 2030, and also the Global Digital Compact. So we'll see how that is into play. Finally, why is WSIS+20 important? It might sound again like, why do we care about something that was, agreed 20 years ago? And who cares about the information society when we talk about digital things these days? As I was saying, the documents adopted back then have this technological neutrality approach, so they are still pretty much applicable to everything we talk about today, be it artificial intelligence, blockchain, quantum computing, I don't know, whatever you want to talk about. And it is also important to look at, goals set back then and how we have not really managed to achieve many of them. So in this sense, the WSIS+20 is an opportunity to reflect critically on these things and on what we can do better to actually advance the vision that was set back then. And then it's maybe also this opportunity to bring a bit more clarity into what we call the global digital governance architecture. If you look back at the original WSIS outcome documents, they do talk about the multi-stakeholder and multilateral nature of internet governance. And you know how sometimes we tend to put these things as in conflict with each other, whereas if we read carefully through these documents, they actually do coexist, and we also see it in practice. So maybe, we can just underline that again, that we don't have to have one or the other. We can actually have both. Extending the mandate of the IGF and strengthening it, whatever we mean by strengthening it, and maybe bringing a bit more clarity around the roles and responsibilities of various UN entities when it comes to the global digital governance architecture, because this is also something we have been discussing over the past at least 3 years around duplication of efforts and use of resources which are already strained. So how are we doing that? I'm going to stop here. Thanks a lot for the time and happy to answer questions.
Thanks very much, Serena, and lots to digest from your information and background. We are going back 20 years, and there's just so much to try and catch up for those of us who were not there at the beginning. I will turn the time now to William. We're very privileged to have him here to let us kind of have a look behind the veil on preparations for UN negotiations coming out of Australia, as well as their efforts to help the whole region to prepare. William, go ahead.
Thanks, Joyce. And I understand this. Yeah, perfect. The Secretariat's going to put some slides on the screen. Absolute pleasure to be here today, and thank you for making the time, everyone. If we go straight to the next slide, I guess my remarks will kind of build off what Serena has been talking about in terms of the history of the WSIS, and I guess offer a government lens to why it's important and how we're going about actually negotiating this thing called WSIS+20. The first thing to note is that WSIS+20 is a UN resolution, and being a UN resolution, it kind of serves a really important bridge between the multi-stakeholder world that many in the technical community would be familiar with, and the multilateral world, that is the United Nations, the ITU, UNESCO, UNCTAD, all of the UN system agencies that also contribute to digital development and transformation. And WSIS+20 is really that important intersection between those things, and also a really important intersection with national and domestic policy for many governments as well. Next slide, please. I think that context is really helpful when you understand how governments are approaching the negotiations. And this slide tries to draw out some of those linkages. Many governments, including my own, are very focused on some of the content issues facing the internet at the moment, things like social media regulation, online safety, AI, the delivery of online services, digital public infrastructure, mis and disinformation, competition arrangements, and are also very concerned with the bottom of this diagram, which is around what's the infrastructure that we need, how do we achieve digital inclusion, how do we achieve affordability, how do we achieve reliability with the internet. In the middle is the kind of technical layer that many on this call, I imagine, operate within. But WSIS kind of sits across all three of these layers and almost acts as a bit of a bridge. It creates global norms, it supports institutions and the mandates of those institutions. It deals with, as Serena talked about, the issue of internet governance itself. And it also supplies a development agenda for how we bring everyone into the information society. And next slide, please. So with that kind of context in mind, when governments are really looking at these issues, they're looking at these issues holistically. They're looking at what can they achieve for their citizens, businesses, national objectives. And this will play out in this sort of helpful roadmap that the co-facilitators have released. The first phase has already been completed, and that was about, I guess, setting the rules of the game, outlining how we were going to negotiate the WSIS+20. The next two phases are happening between now and December. We have co-chairs who are Kenya and Albania, and they held a stock-taking session last Friday to, I guess, formally kick off this next stage of the process. On the 9th and 10th of June, they will hold some open consultation sessions with the community, and you can register virtually to attend those. One of those is helpfully in a Asia Pacific friendly time zone, and one is in a North American time zone, so you can choose which of those you may wish to attend, but they will be taking forward statements and opportunities to hear from the community. There'll be a range of other consultation opportunities as well, including at the IGF in Oslo and at the WSIS Forum in Geneva. And then there'll be a further round of these virtual consultations in October. This is all feeding into phase 3, which is around the negotiation process. Later this month, we will see a draft elements paper. And I guess that's trying to set out what topics the WSIS+20 will try and deal with, building on that list from the previous slide. In August, we will see a zero draft of the text. And this is kind of the key document for many governments, as it outlines what the draft text of that resolution that the UN is going to agree to. And then we will negotiate that between October and November, and in the lead up to a high-level meeting of all governments, ministers, ambassadors, as well as other stakeholders in December to actually formally adopt this document. On the right-hand side, you'll see a number of input processes. These have been going on for some time and continuing to go on. And these are really opportunities to collate views and ideas and thoughts into processes that can be then digested by governments through the intergovernmental negotiation. The key ones for the community here are the outputs from this year's IGF, and the WSIS Forum high-level event will be really, really important input documents. So I would encourage anyone who is either planning on coming to one of those events or participating virtually to contribute to that process. Next slide, please. I guess to kind of equip everyone on this call to sort of understand what to care about out of the many, many processes that are going to be going on. On the left-hand side, you'll see a number of documents that have or will emerge. The first is the CSTD's report into WSIS that's available on UNCTAD's website. It's a very long read, but if you're interested in kind of what Serena was talking about, how we actually got here and how much progress has been made, that's the document there. There's also a resolution that started to set out what some member states might want to see from the WSIS+20 process, and that will appear after it goes through a process at ECOSOC, another one of these UN bodies, in about July. You'll start to see many member governments coming out with non-papers or discussion papers talking about various topics. You'll obviously see the elements paper, which is the co-facilitators document that will set out what topics WSIS+20 will deal with. And there'll be a consultation between member states to agree what that scope of work looks like. And then obviously you'll see the resolution in its various draft forms as it goes through the negotiation process. So how do you influence all of that? Can you contribute kind of the community's perspective to all of that as governments are working their way through all of those documents? The first is really being clear on the messages. If you understand the process and where the process is up to, it's important to target the message to where we are. So we're at the elements paper stage. It's important to be focusing in on the sort of topics and why topics should be included. If we're at the resolution stage, it will be more difficult to introduce new topics into the discussion, for example. The second point would be to understand how intergovernmental and domestic guidelines work, understand how your government makes decisions, and that way you can help support your government with facts or information. Make sure you find the right people, keep messages simple. Unfortunately, many of us public servants don't have a lot of time. So clear, consistent messaging that's based in fact. Numbers are really popular. So if you've got facts and you've got figures and you can present those in really clear and simple ways, you maximize the opportunity that those are picked up in the negotiations. Next slide, please. just briefly, this is, I guess, an important diagram to understand, because WSIS+20 isn't just something that's happening in New York. It's something that's happening in New York. It's happening in Geneva. It's happening in many of the intergovernmental organizations, for example, the ITU. And it's also happening in capitals, such as here in Canberra or in other capitals around our region. And all of these conversations are being pulled together with a whole host of other topics and issues: AI, data governance, digital transformation, the Sustainable Development Goals, a whole host of those other topics to achieve a position each government is taking to the negotiations. So understanding this and understanding what part you can play in each of those conversations, really, really important. I might just go quickly to the next slide, and I won't dwell on kind of how Australia is doing this, but I thought it was probably useful just to include in the slide pack some of our process. Each government will be different, and some will have more structured processes than others. But it's important to, I think, that most governments are working through the process of what do we need out of the negotiations, what's going to help our citizens and businesses, and how do we get those outcomes? And how they do that will probably differ, but those are kind of the key themes that each government is kind of be working through in their minds. And as a community, if you can offer really useful ideas and solutions and show the practical implications of those solutions and ideas, then you're probably going to find that you get far more of a reception. Next slide, please. Again, this is just kind of talking about how we as Australia are approaching it. Some of our priorities, I won't dwell on them. They're obviously, again, going to be different for different countries. But this kind of tesseract, this kind of triangle of lots of different pieces of the puzzle coming together to inform a national position is, I think, the bit that I would like to kind of leave you with. And if you want to be really influential in that, it's important to understand how your government builds that little triangle. Or how as a region we can communicate some of those key ideas and key messages. And then just finally, if we move to the final slide, and I think it's appeared in the chat as well, this website is the kind of source of all information and truth in relation to the review. And I would really encourage you to follow it very closely so that you can contribute through the process. I might pause there. Thanks, Joyce. I'm very happy to take any questions as we go through.
Thanks very much, William. And if we might just show the slide again and go one back. Runny?
Give me a second.
No worries. They were not, this is not part of the script. So if we go one slide, yes, this slide. I wanted to highlight to everyone the reason that we were so keen to have William speak was because if you look at the top triangle, it says multi-stakeholder working group. And that's something so commendable that the Australian government and department are leading efforts to really do their consultation using a very multi-stakeholder, very inclusive approach with a very diverse group of stakeholders. That's something that I wanted to highlight. I think it's a good takeaway from William's presentation. We will now move on to Jennifer. Welcome to Jennifer. I am so sorry that it is 2:30 a.m. your time now where you are, but thank you so much for joining us in your early morning. Jennifer is going to talk to us a bit about preparations from the technical community and much more. Jennifer, yours.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Really, really happy to be here, seeing a lot of friends in the room and also new people as well. Really happy to kind of walk through a little bit about what the Internet technical community is doing. My name is Jennifer Chung. You usually hear me as part of the APRGF Secretariat, but now I have a different hat on. Well, first of all, the hat I have on right now is for .Asia. .Asia, of course, is a registry operator. But for the Internet technical community, there is a TCCM, which is it's a technical community coalition for multi-stakeholderism. I always have to get that name right. And of course, these are actually a group of internet, network operators and registrars, those who actually operate very critical parts of the internet architecture. And we are a group of people who are very, very devoted to upholding and supporting the multi-stakeholder internet governance. And this is exactly why we're here to talk about what the preparations are. So I want to walk through three main things. First being the key concerns and issues for us. The second thing is, what are the gaps we need to address in the WSIS+20 review? And then finally looking at a little bit about how our preparation efforts have been both in the local, regional, and global stakeholder level. That's the three things I'm going to walk through. I'm going to go back to some key concerns. I'm going to offer four things. I think for the technical community, and I guess really for the broader community as well, the fact that multi-stakeholder model, the multi-stakeholder process of discussing and governing all that we look at in internet governance is extremely important. As DNS technical operators, we rely on this multi-stakeholder process of internet governance, which is actually grounded in, the ICANN and IETF processes as well, to establish these policies to coordinate implementation for the global internet. So government support, and thank you, William, again, for really outlining Australia's great support of this multi-stakeholder model. It is really critical to continue to have this robust function and actual legitimacy of how we're looking at governing and managing the critical parts of the internet. The second thing that the internet technical community is very interested in, of course, it's actually hand in hand with the next one as well, is interoperability and coordination. So the global nature of this multi-stakeholder model really mirrors the structure of the global internet and really supports this coordinated policy development effort to enable interoperability. Coordination is actually self-explanatory, of course. Without government support for this model, technical operators such as .Asia and other registry operators around the world, it would be much more difficult for us to continue this coordination. We would be more subject to individual jurisdictional governance, and it would actually risk us having a much more difficult time to actually coordinate, manage these resources effectively. And the fourth thing really is stakeholder expertise. A lot of the different stakeholder groups have their own expertise and areas that they can bring to the table. But without the technical community participating actively in the from the agenda setting to the public policy making, the resulting policy decisions will not actually reflect technical realities and operational necessities. What I really like to say usually is, we have the know-how to keep the internet running. We have the know-how to let you know this. So when you're looking at public policy, please do not break the internet. So our technical expertise is key for informed digital policy decisions, especially those that touch on operational aspects on how the internet is managed. So now I'm going to move on a little bit about what we see as gaps that need to be addressed in the WSIS+20 review. Again, offering five points. The very first one is something that you probably think I'll be saying right off the bat, which is multi-stakeholder internet governance. We really need for this review to affirm the support of the multi-stakeholder model. This can avoid fragmentation in policy and governance of the internet and ensures a voice for all of the relevant stakeholders, including technical operators in all of the policy discussion and development, especially noting that, no group acting alone can effectively respond to the complex challenges that governing and managing all these resources actually presents, and broader participation always leads to more robust and innovative, legitimate outcomes. The second thing is something that probably this community has also experienced if you've taken part in the Global Digital Compact process last year. There's lots of lessons to be learned there, but what we're calling for here in the WSIS+20 review process is a transparent and inclusive process. And I'm sure, you and Dessa, who's the secretariat for this process, have taken, note of all of this, and they know very well that, listening to all the stakeholders in all the diversity in all the different regions is extremely important to have a legitimate and robust review. So learning from that. And then the third one also, again, is something that this community probably has heard many times as well. And it is really affirming support for the IGF as the premier multi-stakeholder forum for the discussion of internet governance and digital policy issues. So strengthening the IGF is something that's really important when we're looking at this as well. We have to lean especially on I think it's now 177. I think last I heard from Anya last Friday when she was presenting in the Brazil IGF, it was 177 and counting, national, regional, sub-regional, and youth initiatives, especially for Asia Pacific. I know we have a growing number of especially youth initiatives, which is really exciting. But we really need to lean on this. And how do we do that? We really need stable funding and organizational support to strengthen and involve this IGF and the whole ecosystem into a more sustainable and permanent fixture in this discussion and multi-stakeholder dialogues. And a role for the IGF looking at the global digital policy agenda and framing all the discussions and discourses that feed into the WSIS forums and other UN initiatives is really important as well. Another thing that Asia Pacific is probably very, keen to look to strengthening as well is the solutions to facilitate the greater participation from underrepresented unrepresented groups, especially those from the global majority, and for all the stakeholders to be able to participate in this more open and inclusive and transparent WSIS+20 process. The last two really kind of, explains itself as well, preventing the duplication of any of these processes, noting that a lot of us really, this is outside of our daily job. A lot of you here in the room, I know, that are volunteering your time to actually look to strengthening all of this discourse as well. So preventing duplication and fragmentation actually helps us with our bandwidth and resources, very limited, especially here in Asia Pacific. Even if we're not talking about technical community, that some of us are actually quite small domain operators, registry operators, and some of you come from civil society think tanks, even some governments themselves within their departments, there is limited bandwidth to be able to follow all of these processes if they are duplicated and siloed off into all the discussion. So it's really important to prevent the fragmentation of the discussion. So keeping it non-duplicative is actually a good thing for all of us. And then finally, when we look at a WSIS+20 review, you think about it's 20 years on, and I know Serena has talked about it as well, bringing us through the entire historical development. And you wonder, hey, 20 years on, is the language still appropriate? And how do we map this? There's talk about mapping the Global Digital Compact implementation to this review as well. How do we achieve that without opening the WSIS action lines and, risking, it going somewhere that we may not want to see it go? And the answer really is, you being part of this webinar is the first step. The next step is, I think there was a link that was put in the chat as well, is to sign up for the stakeholder consultations. And what it is that I guess the WSIS+20 review co-facilitators and also the entire process really wants to know is, what is it that is crucial for Asia Pacific region? What is it that's crucial for the technical community here, as well as those who really want to see the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance carry on? I think that is really important for us to really take a stance here, really leveraging the opportunities that we have available for us, and definitely sign up for that stakeholder consultation. I think both timings might be a bit difficult for some of us. There is one that's more Asia Pacific friendly, but I know a lot of this community also may be traveling over to perhaps the Europe region for the ICANN meeting. So hopefully that it will be able to match some free time for you to be able to go in and see what happens here. And then lastly, I think I'm going to stop here to see if there's any questions, but really happy to answer any if you have any questions regarding the technical community preparations or really Asia Pacific as a whole. Back to you, Joyce.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. And I might make a note as well for our audience that, Jennifer has been very deeply involved in all facets of not only the WSIS+20 review process, but also the GDC when it happened. And she's one of the very prominent voices to represent the Asia Pacific community. And I really thank her for her efforts in contributing into the process. So our very own Jennifer, yay. I will now turn the time over to Anita. Anita is going to tell us a little bit more about preparations, particularly from civil society stakeholders, and as well, what might be some gaps that need to be addressed in the review. So Anita, on to you.
Thanks so much, Joyce, and thank you to speakers who came ahead of me. I'm sorry, I have a bad throat recovering from a flu. I hope I'm audible and clear. I just wanted to take off from all the wonderful presentations. Has been a pleasure to listen. These are stories sometimes you like to hear again and again because it's about that favorite narrative, which you want to hold on to. And just like Sorina mentioned, there are some favorite parts that that resonate even today from the WSIS Geneva and Tunis declarations. Particularly from the Geneva Declaration, I'd like to point to certain aspects, I think, that inspire us, which is about an information society for all based on shared knowledge. And this idea of shared knowledge, despite the wonderful initiatives that are part of the digital commons, I would submit is still an incomplete project. So the Geneva Declaration talks about how we recognize that building an inclusive information society requires new forms of solidarity, partnership, and cooperation amongst governments and other stakeholders. And I think that this is a task that has happened in right earnest in some places, but there is, I think, room for improvement in many others. And I would certainly say that bridges between the technical community and the civil society groups, between social movements and academia, all of these are very, very important. There's another, which is one of my favorites, which is about the rich public domain that is essential for the growth of the information society. So in these times, when we talk about digital public infrastructure, for instance, we talk about tech stack, we talk about data stacks, we talk about the data commons. I really look at this particular paragraph in the Geneva Declaration as an important guiding principle. A rich public domain is essential for the growth of the information society, creating multiple benefits such as an educated public, new jobs, innovation, business opportunities, and advancement of sciences for all. And it underscores the role of public institutions, this particular paragraph. I'd also like to say that much of this, including the idea that we must harness the potential of technologies towards development goals, including the eradication of poverty and hunger. And in these times of hyper-solutionism, when we are bringing in AI solutions, a few years ago, we brought in blockchain solutions. We seem to be thinking that, a little bit, in the hyper-solutionist mode, that technology will drive away all these problems. But human society is complex and human civilization is indeed very complex. And therefore, all of this is work in progress. And on many of these parameters, we really have to take cognizance that the sobering reality is that there is regression, right? In terms of many SDGs, on a couple of them, in many countries, we've actually seen a slide back. Then what is it about this technological paradigm that we are not doing right is a very, very important question. And in that regard, I'd like to quote a very important paragraph in the Geneva Declaration, which is about the duties we owe to the community. Because you will recall the early 2000s with all the enthusiasm, the excitement, the promise of technologies for freedoms was all about freedoms, right? But those that went to Geneva actually had the wisdom to say that it's really, really important that for a free and full development of everybody in society, it's not only about your freedom and mine, your rights and mine, it's also about our duties and responsibilities towards society. And this we know is under grave threat because the freedoms of some, of troll armies, of misogynistic folks, of opportunistic fly-by-night businesses has become the destiny of unfreedom for the majority. So we have to remember this. I think we do have to, as civil society particularly, I'd like to put on the table the truth, the reality that we are in very, very hard times. And this really requires us to look at why the information society today, as was recognized again during the times in Geneva, that the benefits of information society is not really evenly distributed, right? Not only that, the harms are certainly unevenly distributed. You know, whether you look at labor rights, whether you look at critical minerals, the way in which a particular way by which the trajectory of innovation has evolved has resulted in deep inequality and grievous harm to the majority. And therefore, I want to now tell you a little bit of a story, which I think all of you are familiar with, but it would certainly augur well for us to think about the implications for why we are headed to the WSIS+20 milestone. And this is the story of a company that in the month of May disconnected the International Criminal Court's top prosecutor from its services in response to President Trump's administration sanctions. Do you know the story? The International Criminal Court's top prosecutor, because the Trump administration did not want a particular case against the US to be taken up by the International Criminal Court. So in the US administration law, businesses can be cut off by the administration if businesses continue to do their bit and have contracts with agencies that the administration does not approve of. So what happened? And this is just a month ago. So what really happened is that with this disconnection of the email and other services, the company maintained that it had not withdrawn any other service, but the International Criminal Court provided a clarification that the entire office of the prosecutor of the ICC was affected by the sanctions. What are we talking about here? We're talking about a critical infrastructure that we need, cloud services, email services, all part of the public domain, isn't it? All of this, which are necessary to continue life on the planet, essentially, all relevant operations, services, being held to ransom, being weaponized, right? So this is just a small executive order with cascading impacts on the infrastructures of the world. Now, let's situate this in relation to the WSIS, Tunis, and WSIS Geneva declarations. We had, in the Tunis phase, as Sorina pointed out, very, very important considerations. The consideration of financing of the information society and the consideration of internet governance and enhanced cooperation, which basically means that the multilateral international system has to come up with different stakeholders to posit a solution that would be lasting, that would be just, that would be equitable and inclusive, right? To this idea that we have this wonderful, wonderful public facility, global public facility called the internet. And in fact, the declaration in Geneva points to the global facility called the internet, but the terminology public is conspicuous by its absence, also signaling what a contentious issue it was to brand the internet a public facility, right? It is indeed a public infrastructure. But of course, politics of the 2000s aside, we fast forward the politics of today, and we see that today, tech is even more weaponized, not just for war, I mean, that everybody understands that there are innumerable, contracts that are contentious, where we are actually seeing terrible AI-supported kinds of, ammunition that may be used against the most vulnerable. We know that. But I'm not talking just about war. I'm talking also about, what may be similar to the tariff war, right? Economic battles, social engineering, social control. So I'd like to really open it up, and I would like to really ask everybody, here, and I think the technical community, civil society, academia, progressive social movements really have to work in tandem against, I would say, repressive governments, against opportunistic and greedy businesses. We really have to stand together, I think, to call out. And I would like to ask the question, where is the jurisdictional immunity when we are actually seeing this kind of unilateral action against the International Criminal Court? Yeah. Where is the jurisdictional immunity for an important organization like ICANN, whose headquarters is located in the US? So when we talk about the multi-stakeholder approach, one appeal I have to all of us sitting here is that we need democracy in multi-stakeholderism with a North Star. We don't need democracy for the sake of democracy, right? We need multi-stakeholderism in democracy, democratic multi-stakeholderism, towards a North Star called justice, equity, inclusion, diversity, pluralism, economic democracy, and so many other things. So I would like us to really look at Paris 59, 60, and 61 in the Tunis agenda and say that Paris 59 talks about the internet, the governance of the internet, including social, economic, and technical issues. We also need to understand that today's social, economic, and technical issues are all intermeshed. For instance, if you have a digital ID program, it's linked to your social security, and your social security is linked to your very survival as a single woman, as perhaps, informal worker in gig value chains. So the entire context here is about cutting edge international public policy issues, which are also referenced in Paris 1661. In conclusion, I just have to say that there are certain very critical unfinished agendas which are part of civil society interests. Civil society should think of themselves as stakeholders who hold up the North Star of justice and equity. So we are not there because we need to be there. We are there because of a purpose, just like we expect our governments to uphold these things because that's part of our social contract. When we send our governments to negotiate on our behalf, we expect our governments to hold to our constitution, right? Our constitutional rights. So there are, I think, at least minimum 7 agenda items. Today, when digital companies refuse to pay digital services taxation, we really lose billions of dollars of fiscal revenue in our countries. It's untenable. Countries in the African region, in the Latin American region, and in the Asian region that are really, really of those 50-odd countries in the world, which are unfortunately labeled least developed countries. By no means are they least developed. They are rich cultures. But of course, their income levels by the standard GDP calculation does not fit, the World Bank index, right? These countries require fiscal revenue. They don't require charity. So we need companies to pay up. We really need international equity in taxation. We need an equitable data governance arrangement in the world that promotes human rights. And data is a common heritage of humanity. We need to protect the planetary boundaries. We need to upgrade the human rights framework to account for data rights. We need digital public infrastructures created by and for the global South. We're, of course, grateful to countries that have made advancements, that are willing to share their technological know-how. We're very grateful. But that doesn't come with a certain colonial mindset, right? It comes with the need to have solidarity, co-implication, mutuality in this information society. And we certainly need an responsible and responsive AI paradigm where responsibility must come with accountability and liability. The buck must stop with somebody. It cannot be that harms are, unleashed on civilization. So I would really like to also look at this wonderful point that Sorina made, and this is my last submission. Yes, in 1998, the WTO did bring out this moratorium in customs duties because those were early times and the digital economy had not developed. And so somebody said, well, somebody's sending somebody CDs. Let's not tax those CDs at the border, right? But today you have Netflix. Today you have streaming services. Today you have e-commerce. And in these services, why should we have a moratorium on tariffs and duties? What do developing countries really benefit under the circumstances? Do we understand that it's really, really important for us to be able to tax these services at the border? Do we understand that that is from where we will get the revenue in our countries to be able to build an information society? So I would really like to think about the economic justice, social justice, gender justice aspects, and the planetary boundaries aspect as a very important agenda for civil society. And the challenge for civil society is to be able to influence all stakeholders who want to be with us on our North Star. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anita. And what you have shared with us today is really where the rubber meets the road. A lot of the time when, the diplomats or when even ourselves, when we are, in a windowless room trying to negotiate on a tax, we can often forget the actual critical real life issues and impact that some of these policies are going to have. And I just absolutely love how you said democracy of a North Star. I mean, that is just goosebumps moment for me personally. I think it's a very beautiful way of thinking about it and of trying to motivate people. I'm going to move on quickly to the Q&A portion. And the first question that I'd like for us to consider would be, what would be perhaps the topmost or one or two topmost issues that you think would be at stake for the WSIS+20 this year? Anybody would like to take a stab first? You can raise your hand or, however you'd like. Sarina, since you've touched your hair, so I take that as a sign.
Thank you. I can give it a try. Well, I don't know if at stake, is the right terminology for what I'm going to say, but as we were saying earlier, it is the year when we are going to look at the mandate of the Internet Governance Forum. And maybe this is also a good opportunity to look carefully at the mandate of the Internet Governance Forum and all the things that are actually outlined in the Tunis agenda, and see if there are elements there that we want or may want to focus a bit more moving forward. So that would be one. And then the second, as I was trying to also highlight at the beginning, maybe seeing a bit if we can bring some sort of more coherence and consistency in what we call global digital governance architecture, in particular at the UN level. And there were a few comments in the chat here about, duplication and having more and more events to follow. And William was also saying this earlier, how it's difficult to actually be engaged in everything. So maybe this is actually our opportunity to do something about it, because as I was saying, we have been discussing this at least for the past 3 years in the context of the Global Digital Compact negotiations. But as you're also saying, we haven't really made progress. It feels like it all became a little worse. So these two things, I would say, are some of the key issues that we might want to look at as we discuss WSIS+20, and then all the issues around substantive topics around the action lines and their implementation, and digital divides and environment and safety and security and all these things we wanted to make quite a lot of progress on 20 years ago, and look at us, we're not really there. And on that note, another thing I wanted to raise is this issue of how are we assessing progress, because we don't really have targets, we don't have tools to measure. So maybe that's also something we can look at in this context. If we look at implementation, how do we measure the implementation, and how do we measure if we have achieved these goals set 20 years ago and also 10 years ago? Thank you.
If I may,
Anita.
thank you. I completely agree with Sorina on her top 2 points, but as she also mentioned, this is a little bit like making choices among your children, which of it is your favorite. So it's a little bit complicated, whether it's the digital divide or whether it's the global architecture or, whether it's a redefinition of human rights or whether it's international solidarity in a world that's so fraught. I would really think that we have to focus on the financing. Otherwise the inequity will just simply persist, right? And we have to focus on the financing from a public finance perspective, because the more we kind of rely on private finance, we would really be closing our eyes and ears to the evidence of the past 25 years that private finance does not work. Markets don't go where there is no profit, and that's the way it is, right? So infrastructures need public finance, and we do need to use the instruments that economic wisdom actually behooves us to look at. So that's very important. The second, I think, is to really take cognizance of the fact that data justice is vital. And by that, we don't just mean, all the rules for privacy and data protection. By that, we mean really looking at data as an important resource, but one that must be placed, alongside social, environmental, and other priorities. Like, how much more data do we need? Do we need data to solve all our problems? Do we need data at all for certain problems? And if we do need data to really funnel intelligence through our AI models, then how can we localize intelligence? How do we localize accountability, control, resource governance, and all of that? So I do think that data is about everything and digital is about everything. So I would put financing and data governance as important priorities. I also think that since William is here, I do understand that the decade of data is something that the Secretary General had already talked about. And this is not going to get solved in the next couple of issues, but I think some governments need to get together to say that in the next 5 to 10 years, we do need a treaty, where we have a perspective, a rights-oriented perspective on data, social justice, and environmental justice. Thank you very much.
Jennifer.
Thanks. It's so nice going after Serena and Anita because they've made some really great points here. I think speaking from the technical community, I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier. We have a vested interest in keeping the internet working. We don't want the internet to break. So with that, it's multi-stakeholder internet governance. That's really the top priority for the internet technical community. WSIS review is a lot broader than a lot of the interests that we, that touch on internet governance specifically. But for us, we need to keep the internet open, global, interoperable, secure, all of that, to keep it the way that everybody is enjoying. And to avoid the risks of, there's a lot of geopolitical pressure right now on many, many things. This is one of them. So that is probably the key point I want to, it's not really a risk, but it can be a risk if we don't, articulate it and support it and really, bring it to the review.
Thanks, Jennifer. And before I get to you, William, I do notice Anita has to drop off, and I just want to thank Anita so much. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for giving us your time. The rest of us will remain in this call.
Apologies, I'm not able to stay fully. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I'll go on to William.
Thanks, Joyce. And look, just building on what the other speakers have said, from a government perspective, I think the challenge of digital is that it is getting increasingly complex. There are more and more moving parts to that conversation. And it's a question of how do we move progress on digital transformation and development forward without breaking one or more of those constituent parts underneath it, right? And I think some of the issues that were raised by the earlier speakers are really good examples of really topical and really complex, we call them wicked problems in policy land. They're really difficult problems to solve. WSIS+20 is the vehicle, I think, to get global action on some of those wicked problems. But we have to do it in a way that doesn't break one of the other pieces that is kind of working well. And the internet, the internet's kind of technical foundations is a really good example of that. And so achieving that progress without kind of breaking things, I think, is for me kind of the biggest challenge of this WSIS process.
Thanks, William. I'm going to, because of lack of time, do want to try and still capture some questions from the audience. And so I'll pick a question to read out and ask for you to respond. You don't have to make a response if you don't wish to. So this comes from Azim Sajad, who asks, what are the effective ways to enhance cooperation to bridge the digital governance and digital divide? Yes, William?
Look, really, really good question. I think, and Serena mentioned it in her previous answer around measurement, I think is really, really important. Having transparent and accountable ways to show what progress is, I think is really important. The other thing that I would say is, and picking up on Anisha's point earlier about financing, there are limited resources, and anyone who is following the UN space at the moment will see that those resources are getting increasingly limited. So how we enhance cooperation, I think, is to be really targeted and really selective in what we invest in, and have clear measurable outcomes from that. And if things aren't working, then we need to change tack. But really focusing in on what can we do, what are the actions, specific actions that we can kind of build into the WSIS framework. I think the WSIS architecture, the action lines and stuff is a really, really solid foundation on which to build. And it's a matter of taking that really, really strong foundation and pointing at specific problems and saying, solve this, solve that, fix this, fix that. And I think using that sort of methodology, we can really start to enhance cooperation, and people can really understand kind of, well, okay, that's my role on that issue. My role is not on that issue. I can contribute this, and we can start to pull together the resources that are available to achieve meaningful change.
Thanks, William. Serena or Jennifer, you want to see if you'd like to respond? Serena, yep.
If I may just add one point to what William was saying, I would say also focusing a bit more on building capacities at a national level, but capacities in the sense of empowering individuals and communities to actually put in place whatever actions and recommendations that are relevant at the national and community level. Because at least from the global north, we tend to have this tendency sometimes to say, okay, we're going to give this money to, I don't know, connect schools, and then we forget about everything else. But how do we build long-term capacities and this kind of institutional and local level capacity so people can actually take, their own destiny in their own hands in some way? So yeah, more focus on that, I would say.
I'm just going to wait and see if Jennifer would like to answer. If not, I will move on.
I guess both William and Serena have really covered a lot of it. But Serena's last point is extremely important for Asia Pacific. I think there's a really diverse range of capacities and resources, especially in our region, and having a targeted and considered approach to actually bring up capacity is really important for us. This webinar is one very good example of really targeted capacity building on a very specific topic that hopefully the IPRGF and APAC community can really take advantage of and leverage.
Thanks very much. And I do agree. I think this webinar was meant exactly to be a kind of capacity building initiative as well, because the hope was to, not only get people more involved in participating, in contributing to the process, but also to be, thinking about the issues and helping to shape and influence opinions as well, with local governments, for example. I think what I'd like to do, because we only have really 2 minutes left to this webinar, and I wish we had dedicated way more time than we had anticipated to this. What I'd like to do is to invite our speakers to do a wrap up, some final remarks, but to kind of shape them around what they think or what you think would be the key issues that as the APRGF or Asia Pacific community, we really should prioritize, because, governments don't have a lot of time and attention for everything. So what might be some of those key issues? And as well, how should the community contribute? What would be the best ways to do that? Who would like to start first? So I think we said we'd go backwards, so it would be Jennifer to go first.
Thanks, Joyce, giving me not so much time to think about it, but really reiterating that, this is the first step, being part of this webinar. At the end of the day, the WSIS+20 review sits and is rooted in the multilateral UN framework. The governments will come together and negotiate this. But the governance of the internet is really important and must remain multi-stakeholder, and the management of this critical infrastructure really rely on all of us to come together. So we have to bridge the gap of the multi-stakeholder process within this multilateral space. So really, APRGF community, APEC community, think about the issues that matter to you the most. There are APEC-specific issues that really need to be surfaced and voiced in this. So we really need to proactively engage to ensure all of this is reflected in effective outcomes, and the legitimacy of these outcomes really affect how we look into internet governance going forward. And finally, I guess, strengthening your own capacity, looking at the different resources that have been posted on the chat as well. I know Mark Havel, I'm going to call out one very good example that Eurodig's been doing. So learning also from the good practices and the outcomes that come from the other regions are really important for APRGF and APEC community. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. William?
Thanks, Joyce. Firstly, let me thank this community for giving us the opportunity to come and have a chat with you today. I think it's great to see so many engaged and interested people. And as Jen said, that's the first step, is understanding what this is and understanding how you might be able to contribute. I think the key thing from a government perspective is we have so much expertise on this call and in this community to help governments navigate the many complex and difficult topics and conversations over the next 6 or so months. And I would encourage everyone to make themselves available in the best way that you can, and be able to share some of those ideas and solutions. WSIS has a really proud history of multi-stakeholderism. And I think you will find many governments are interested in your ideas and solutions as we go through the process. So if you can make those readily accessible for governments, then I think that will be really helpful. And look, really just thank you again for taking the opportunity. Thanks, Joyce.
Thanks, William. And finally, Serena.
Thank you. I wouldn't be able to tell you what should be the priorities at the regional level, but as Jennifer was saying, it's important for you to actually spend a bit of time thinking about those. And as William was also saying earlier, be as concrete and as specific as possible in what you want to achieve out of this review. And on the second question about how to contribute, I think William also outlined some of the opportunities earlier on, looking at the roadmap that was put forward by DESA. There are stakeholder engagements, consultations happening specifically next week and then along the lines, but then also using this kind of spaces where you can talk to each other and also finding ways to talk to your government if you're not a governmental stakeholder. That would be important, because at the end of the day, it is a document that is going to be negotiated by member states. So the more input you can provide to your government, the more chances you have for your priorities to actually be reflected in the process. And I'm sure many governments are actually looking forward to this kind of opportunities, as William was also mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serena. And I want to take this chance to thank all our speakers, including Anita, for giving us your time, for being very thoughtful with your responses, and for being very flexible when we have had to adapt to this session and the lack of time. I do apologize. But I think we gained a lot from your knowledge, your experience, and even your expertise in some of these matters. And I hope that as part of the audience, that we would have a lot of takeaways from this session. Now, as just final housekeeping, I did start this webinar saying that this is the first of a series of seminars, or webinars, sorry, not seminars. But I I do look forward to the upcoming ones. I do envision them to be less of a panel sort of talking heads style, but really more of a dialogue, because we would enter a time when negotiations would be starting, consultations would have started. And for the next few webinars, what we'd like to do is really to hear from the APR-IGF community your views on the issues that are being tabled for the WSIS+20 review process. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. And we will end this webinar here. Thank you.